Once upon a time, and it was not very long ago, white supremacy was the official ideology of this country. If you look at the racial divide in this country and the vast inequalities that we see between different communities, well, we did not get here by accident. This was the result of deliberate policy. I hope this is not a controversial statement, but The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates is a good reference if you want a refresher on the 20th century history of racism and its disastrous impact for people of color. And although I have not read it yet, An Indigenous People's History of the United States is this year's recommended read for Unitarian Universalists. So I also recommend that work to you for a look at another strand of our national history where the ideology of white supremacy has explicitly shaped policy and outcomes. But having gotten where we are, there is no longer a need for an explicitly racist ideology or explicitly racist policy to maintain all of this. The situation can stay the same just by inertia, just through the weight of accumulated inequality and institutional memory and cultural habit, and by people pursuing their own interests when those interests have been shaped by the context of 4 centuries of explicitly white supremacist policies. The poet Guante says, "Skinheads and Nazis, intentional, ideological, hate-filled racists, are like the shark. White supremacy is not the shark. It's the ocean we're all swimming in. Sharks kill 12 people a year. Meanwhile, thousands drown." Unitarian Universalism dreams of a world in which no one drowns in the waters of white supremacy. We dream of a world free of all oppressions, not just racism, but sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, all the forces that divide us and raise up some at the expense of others, or threaten people with violence and harm. But the logic of white supremacy, to return just to the example of race, says it's not enough to just be non-racist. We can be personally non-racist all day long, and the institutions of white supremacy culture will continue to do their lethal work. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be intentionally committed to dismantling the institutions of white supremacy. They will not just go away on their own. And we have to be intentionally committed to unlearning and challenging the culture of white supremacy, the water we're all swimming in and day out, often without even being aware of it. And that goes the same for challenging the culture of sexism and homophobia and so on. Now, the point is not to be just anti-this and anti-that, to define ourselves by what we are against. And Unitarian Universalism upholds in its principles and in its history a strong, positive vision of a world where peace, love, equality, and inclusiveness are core values. The result is a society of human flourishing. Right? We believe in the power of the human spirit. We believe that if the intellect and the imagination and the heart of all people are set free, we will all soar together to undreamt of heights. We believe that when diverse people come together in a spirit of openness and generosity, the community we build together is made ever richer and more glad through that diversity. We believe that we need one another and that it is good that it is so. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called this vision the beloved community, a community where all people can live in freedom and peace as siblings, rejoicing in our shared humanity and celebrating our individual differences. Well, all this month, we've been doing a review of our 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, a kind of UU 101. And the vision of the beloved community is implicit in the 7 principles. It has, named or unnamed, inspired the words and deeds of many Unitarian Universalists throughout history right up to our present day. And yet, for that same history, our lofty ideals about peace and freedom and human dignity and especially progress were not necessarily connected to ideals about undoing racism or undoing sexism. Sometimes they were, just as often they were not. Our institutional history is as enmeshed with racism and sexism as any other in America. Unitarian Universalism did not somehow escape this nation's history. In the contemporary era of UU, Our commitment to freedom and individualism has often blunted the other commitments that are implicit in our principles and our ideals, but that are not spelled out. Commitments like undoing racism or undoing sexism. We often leave it up to the individual to decide whether or not that is their thing. Similarly, our principle of congregational polity, congregational independence, means congregations get to decide for themselves which issues they will treat with urgency and which they will ignore. Now, individual freedom is important. Congregational independence is important, right? These are foundational principles of our religious history. But racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like are not just issues like other issues. They deny and erase people's humanity. And when defending people's humanity becomes a question to be taken up or set down at our leisure, something has gone terribly wrong in how we understand the commitments that our religion calls us to. And when the humanity of the person sitting next to us in the sanctuary becomes optional, or our own humanity becomes optional, something has gone terribly wrong in how we understand religious community, or the humanity of the person we are Zooming with. In the last decade, then, as Unitarian Universalism has sought to become more bold and clear in its commitment to undoing those oppressions like racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism, there's been a desire voiced by some to make this vision explicit, to pull it out and highlight it as its own principle, an eighth principle, so that no one need be confused by this idea that, yes, if you are committed to the first principle of inherent worth and dignity, and the second principle of justice and compassion, and the third principle of acceptance, and the fourth of a responsible search for truth, and the fifth of democracy, and the sixth of a peaceful and just global community, and the seventh, which says we are all connected. If you are committed to these principles, then necessarily and inevitably, you are committed to actively taking steps to undo racism and sexism and other oppressions. You are committed to actively defending people's humanity, which includes undoing all those things which seek to negate it. There is no other way to live out our principles in a nation whose institutions were fundamentally shaped by the assumptions of white supremacy and patriarchy and other oppressive ideologies. And since those institutions include our own institutions, that work starts at home. And since anyone raised in this culture has been unavoidably impacted by the assumptions of this culture, that work also includes inner work, the freeing and healing of our own minds and spirits. This is how our religious ideals intersect with the reality of our own history. Maybe someday in some blessed future it will not be so, but this is our reality today. So in 2012, Paula Cole-Jones, then Director of Racial and Social Justice for the Unitarian Universalist Association, worked with others to craft the language for a proposed eighth principle to Unitarian Universalism. The text of the proposed eighth principle is this: we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, it's a little wordy because that's how we roll as UUs. So let's take it bit by bit. It starts by saying, we covenant to affirm and promote. Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal religion. What we share in common is not a set of dogmatic beliefs, but a covenant, a commitment to be together in a certain way and to live out certain principles to the best of our ability and understanding. This would be one of those principles and one of those commitments. We covenant to journey towards spiritual wholeness, meaning first we recognize that we are not there yet. The society we inhabit does not look like the world we dream of. To get there, we have to go on a journey. It will take time. We may get lost. We may encounter setbacks and delays. We will hope for good traveling companions on the way. Hopefully, someone will have a compass, or else we'll navigate by the sun and the stars as best we can. And why do we say we are journeying towards wholeness? Well, this is another way of echoing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that we are all bound up in a single garment of destiny, such that I cannot be free until you are free. And so in a society divided by hatred and prejudice, none of us can truly be whole. We recognize the harm done to everyone, including ourselves. So we covenant to journey toward wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. And this is our dream explicitly stated, right? The beloved community, where all people are made welcome in the fullness of their selves, a community that is then necessarily diverse and multicultural. And note, we have to work to build this community. It won't just come about. It won't just roll in on the wheels of inevitability. And finally, to build this community, the eighth principle says, we will have to take actions to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. In other words, it is not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to intentionally dismantle systems of oppression, and we recognize that those systems live in institutions and they also live in our hearts. And this does not make us bad people. It makes us human. It makes us human. And as such, we recognize that we will have some personal work to do on this journey. So that is the eighth principle. Journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, the idea of an eighth principle has gained some momentum in our movement, but it's not easy to adopt a new principle for the UUA. It's a multi-year process. At the 2017 General Assembly, our annual meetings where we vote on all the things, the delegates thought they were starting the process by voting to direct the UUA board, to appoint a commission to study the issue. If the commission recommended an eighth principle at the next General Assembly, which would have been 2018, it would then have to be voted on at 2 consecutive General Assemblies. And that is what everyone generally assumed would happen. Now, our congregations are independent entities. We don't have to wait for the UUA to do anything. So a small number of congregations began adopting the eighth principle for themselves in advance of the larger movement. And so in the 2017-2018 church year, UUI, our congregation, began a process of considering whether we would adopt an eighth principle. But then a funny thing happened. Late in the year, it became clear that the UUA board, the associational board, had not yet created that commission, and that there was no plan to present an eighth principle at that 2018 General Assembly. Something else was in the works. So I recommended at the time that UUI pause to see what this new thing might be. That year we voted instead to strengthen the welcoming language in our bylaws. And then in 2018, nothing happened. And nothing happened in 2019. And people began to ask, what happened to the eighth principle? It was like it just fell out of the larger conversation. And people at UUI have been asking me, what happened? What is going on with that? Well, this past year, we finally have some clarity. The UUA board has finally appointed the commission, but it is not a commission to recommend an eighth principle. It is a commission to reconsider all the principles, all of them. And the question is, are these 7 commitments still the best expression of who we are as a religious people? And the board has told the commission to hold nothing sacred or untouchable in its recommendations, either in language or in number. There's nothing sacred about the number 7. Now that is not in and of itself shocking, right? The 7 principles were never meant to become a new creed carved in stone for all time. We are in fact required to reconsider them at least every 15 years. But it is very clear that the commission's work will not be some pro forma consideration, but rather a deep and challenging collective conversation about who we are and what defines us. And it is clear that this is expected to result in changes. And one of those changes will include incorporating the eighth principle into the result. And this could look like different things, right? This could look like adding the proposed eighth principle as a new principle. It could look like putting the eighth principle up at the front as a kind of mission statement. It could look like rewriting all the principles, that they all reflect the spirit of the eighth principle and a commitment to building the beloved community. The UUA board charged the commission with these words: our commitment to personal and institutional and cultural change rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, and multicultural values and practices is love in action and should be centered in any revision of the seven principles. Our commitment to anti-oppression is love in action and should be centered in any revision of the seven principles. And the other thing that the UUA board did that is very interesting is that it named love as a core UU value. The word love does not appear at all in any of the seven principles. It is named in one of the six sources that are said to inform those principles and shape our living tradition. But the UUA board identified love as a core UU value and said, we therefore charge this commission to root its work in love as a principal guide in its work, attending particularly to the ways that we have understood and articulated love and how we have acted out of love. 2 weeks ago, when we talked about our freedom principles, I said that a religion whose only story is, this is that religion where you can believe whatever you want. I said that was a religion with no future. I asked us to consider not just in what ways we were free, but in what ways we want to be bound together. What core commitments define us? And one of those core commitments is love. And increasingly, people come to Unitarian Universalism precisely because they are attracted to our theology that says every person is worthy of love, that no one is to be cast out or cast aside, and that we are called to build the beloved community where ultimately all people are held in love. Increasingly, people inspired by our core commitment to love are embracing a commitment not just to freedom, but to liberation, liberation for all. This is the vision we will be asked to consider, to clarify, and to recast in new language with new commitments. The reconsideration of the principles will take several years. It will involve many, many conversations between and among congregations, and ultimately there will be votes, because that is how we do things as UUs. And I'll have to say more about this as it happens, and we will do our part to make sure that UUI is engaged in the process. But for now, as we close out our month-long review of the seven principles, let us give gratitude for all the people who have come before us, who have risked and dared and dreamed and even died so that we might inherit this magnificent religious tradition of Unitarian Universalism, so that we might carry forward its bold vision of freedom, grounded in love, committed to liberation. It is in our hands now. It is in our hearts. May it be our blessing to this beautiful and tender world. Blessed be, and amen.